Today's message is another sermon during my short break from Matthew's Gospel. I promised you 4 sermons. This is sermon number 2. And again, none of them are really related to each other. So these are just things that have come to my mind as I've been teaching through Matthew most recently, and things that I wanted to teach whenever I got the chance. So here they are. Well, this sermon today is about bowing in the temple of Rimmon, which, if I can pronounce that name consistently throughout the rest of the sermon, I'll consider that a victory of some sort. Bowing in the temple of Rimmon, which some of you are expecting that because some of you get the pre-sermon email that I send to, in a sense, help you prep for the message. But some of you are more like, well, what is that going to be about? It just sounds like something very foreign to Christianity, and in many ways it is. For those of you who read the email I sent, I did send you a kind of a spoiler about the content of this message, so you have kind of an idea of where I'm going, maybe. If you read the passage and thought about it, you might have said, oh, okay, I see where this is going. But I'm confident that before reading my email, for those of you that did, you had no real memory of the passage about bowing in the temple of Rimmon and whatever all that is about. So it was probably out of nowhere for you, not a passage or a story that you often think about. For those of you that didn't see the email or haven't read it or just didn't get a chance to read the passage and think about it, you're probably even more bewildered, wondering about this Rimmon and why you should bother hearing a whole sermon about bowing in his temple, something that you, whatever that is, you never really intend to do. But I assure you the message today is quite biblical and does concern 2 very well-known persons. So if you've never heard of Rimmon, you actually have heard of some people that we will be talking about today. One of them is the prophet Elisha. That's Elisha, with the SH, not the J. The second one, not the first one. And then the other person that I know you've heard about is the Aramean general called Naaman, who came to Elisha for healing. This is the man who was a leper and not a Hebrew, but who came to Elisha for healing. And within that story, really at the very end of that story, is the passage I have selected for this sermon about bowing in the temple of Rimmon. So the story should be well known, even if the whole idea of the temple and Rimmon himself is not known to you. These are, in some sense, familiar stories and familiar persons. Now, although this sermon features a cast of prophets and ancient generals and false gods, the real theme of today's sermon is actually consolation for God's people as they love godless people in a godless world. So if you're wondering where this is actually going, the chief word for today is consolation. Consolation for you in spite of everything you face in the world around you. I was wondering, perhaps, as I often give you children a chance to do, if any of you children can tell me what the word consolation means. Any takers on that? You want to get Selena? Go ahead.
It's in the stars. It's like Orion is.
Haha, a constellation. Very important, but that is a different word actually. Okay, so consolation. There's no T in the first part of that. So consolation, this is something that makes you feel better after some kind of sorrow, some kind of suffering. This is something that comes in and restores your hope, gives you a reason to feel better after whatever it was you endured. So consolation in that sense. Now, even a passage as strange as the one I'm going to read today and talk about today, this passage has some consolation for us, and that is what I'm really trying to do with this particular story and my sermon on it. So my outline has 3 headings, which I'll tell you here at the beginning before we read the passage and get started with all of this. So first of all, the passage about bowing in the temple of Rimmon is the ending to the story of Naaman and Elisha. And in my first portion of this sermon, I'm just going to read that story to make sure you're familiar with it and it all gets fresh in your memory before we target the very end of it. So that's the first thing we're doing today in this sermon. The second heading is where things get really odd and complicated, but really the meat of today's sermon. In the ending to that story, we're amazed to see a true servant of God participating in some paganism without any guilt. All right, so bowing in the temple of Rimmon, if it sounds like a pagan thing, well, yeah, it is. It actually is, very much so. And yet somehow we see a true servant of God taking part in that without guilt, apparently. So that's the second heading for today. And then finally, coming around to where all this meets you, you can find consolation in this passage when you sacrifice your own holy desires on account of your love for other people. So that is where I hope the consolation will come in as you try to apply these things to your own life. Now, for those of you who made yourself familiar with the passage ahead of time, you may very well wonder how anything so foreign could possibly help you as a Christian in the modern world. Because as you read that passage and think about what Naaman is going to be dealing with, you're just wondering, like, when am I ever going to deal with something like that? Our own lives seem pretty far removed from Naaman's. We don't live in the same time or the same place as he did, and we don't even really have the same station in life. We're not high-ranking members of governments, nor often in contact with idols and temples. Naaman's life was very much like that, but ours are not. Our lives are very different from his. And yet I hope you'll discover that the temple of Rimmon is actually everywhere. And in spite of your intention to never do such a thing as Naaman plans to end up doing at some point, you actually will, time and again. In fact, as long as you live in this world, in this age, you live inside the temple of Rimmon. I'd like you to picture it that way. You actually live in that situation practically at all times. And you bow in that temple in some capacity repeatedly. This actually is a part of your life as a Christian in this age of the world before Christ returns. And the more you realize that, the more distressing it will be to you on the one hand as a true servant of God. You're going to feel about that situation much the way Naaman feels in this passage we're going to read. And the more distressed you are, the more of a consolation you're going to want. But the more of a consolation you're also going to have as you think about this passage. Or at least I hope it will be the case for you. No matter how foreign it may seem, I hope that you yourself will take the kind of comfort in this that I think is very much possible as you think about this passage and Naaman's conversation with Elisha. So that's what we're doing today in brief. Let's get ready to read the passage and we'll start the actual sermon. So again, as I told you before, this passage is in 2 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse 1. This passage about bowing in the temple of Rimmon is the ending to the story of Naaman and Elisha. And we're going to read that story. I just want to read the whole thing. The story is rather familiar, probably a lot of sermons being taught on this passage, but not really about the ending of the story, which is where I want to target. But we don't want to just jump into the middle of these people's lives and the events of the story. So let's read the whole thing and make sure we're familiar with it. So again, 2 Kings 5, starting in verse 1, we're going to read through verse 19. And it's the very end that is the source of today's sermon. So here we go. Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. So he has this terrible skin disease, in spite of being a very mighty warrior as he was. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel." Then the king of Aram said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. And for those of you wondering why the clothing is in there with the silver and the gold, it was once very hard to actually make clothing and get clothing and keep it clean and in good shape. So 10 changes of clothes actually is a kind of wealth back then. I know for you it's as easy as going to the store and buying more shirts, but back then 10 changes of clothing was actually something. All right, so he, that's Naaman, brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, "And now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me." It happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a great rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, Wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. When he returned to the man of God with all of his company, and came and stood before him, he said, Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant now. But he said, As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Naaman said, If not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offering, nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, Go in peace. So he departed from there some distance. So as you can see from the ending, the passage about bowing in the temple of Rimmon is the conclusion to this story about Naaman and Elisha, and that is the passage where my focus actually is this morning for this sermon. Now that we have the whole story, let's examine the ending. I want to take a closer look at these last few verses of the story and just see what is actually there, what we can learn from these verses. And we see that in this ending, we're amazed that a true servant of God is participating or plans to participate to some degree in paganism, but without any guilt. That is what we see Naaman expects for his future and what I really want to talk about today. So let's talk about these things in some greater detail. The first thing to say about Naaman is that he really is a theological pioneer. And I mean that in all sincerity. He is a theological pioneer, meaning that the way he thinks about God is a very fresh and new thing for a lot of people in his time and place. Let's reread verse 15 just to see what he says here. It says, When he returned to the man of God with all of his company, he came and stood before him and said, Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So now please take a present from your servant. Okay, so this whole experience with Elisha has not only compelled Naaman to believe in the God of Israel, but to believe in the God of Israel alone. He says, I now believe there's no God in all the earth, just here in Israel. There's only one God, and he's here in Israel. Now, people in that time and place viewed the world very differently from us, and just their whole worldview about matters of gods was very different. To them, gods were as numerous as the mountains and the rivers, as numerous as the kinds of weather, and maybe even as numerous as the stars. It was very much the case in the ancient world. If there was any kind of thing in the world or thing happening in the world, there was some kind of God behind that. That is very much the way they think about the world around them. That was their theology. That was their way of thinking about the gods. Furthermore, to those people, all of those gods were equally worthy of worship. How dare you not worship them? I mean, they control all these things we see happening. They made these things. These are the gods. How dare you not worship them? You might choose perhaps to serve one of those gods, but that was simply because no man could possibly serve them all. There are too many of them. So you kind of have to dedicate yourself to one, hope that God is powerful enough to be a force for good in your life, and just bank your hopes on him. But you admit there are other gods out there and they're worthy of worship. Other people are right to worship them. It's correct for them to worship the various gods they have. You would have seen that as a right and also a duty to worship all of those gods. Amazingly, that same mentality was also present in ancient Israel, among whom the one true God had revealed himself. And that is the rather unfortunate story of much of the Old Testament, that even though God revealed himself to Israel very powerfully, they are still very often going after other gods. They have this compulsion or this desire to make sure these other gods get served, and they break away very often from the true God to go serve all of those other gods of the other nations. And really, to be honest with you, I don't know what your impression is, but even reading the Old Testament about some of these men of God we encounter, it just seems to me that very often even they are too comfortable with this idea of other gods. You see, David in his household, he has these idols set up that his, wife has to hide at one point, and you have Jacob and his wives, and they're stealing Laban's gods, and it's like, what are you doing with all these gods, all these idols? Why do you care about all these little figurines and everything when you're serving the true God? Well, it just shows you how prevalent the idea was at that time and place to acknowledge all these gods out there and in some sense to be serving them and doing them worship. Even among Israel, where God had revealed himself so powerfully, there's still all these false gods and all this effort to serve them. Now, into that world steps this man, Naaman. Naaman does not merely devote himself to the worship of Israel's God from now on, but goes so far as to say that no other gods exist, right? There is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Like, that is a tremendous statement for him to make at that time and in that place. Practically no one was saying that sort of thing at this time in history, and certainly not among the pagans like the Arameans. That's Naaman's people, that's his nation. They have their gods like any other nation, and certainly none of them are saying there's no God in all the earth but this one God. Practically no one is saying that. Even in Israel, it's a hard time finding somebody who has that kind of conviction. But Naaman here, he believes that. If you had known Naaman at that time, you would have considered him insane. You would have thought there's something wrong with this guy that has broken the way his mind works. The gods fill heaven and earth, and yet Naaman thinks only one God exists. That's the way you would have considered it. It's just obvious. There are gods everywhere. But Naaman, something's wrong with him. He thinks there's only one God and only in this one nation on the whole planet. And that's what I mean by saying Naaman was a theological pioneer. He was breaking some ground here that practically no one ever broke before him. He was in new territory. Naaman was basically, if you want to put it this way, like the Apostle Paul or the Augustine or the Martin Luther of his time. He's really blazing a different trail here, and no one around him is going to be believing this same thing that he believes, especially when he goes back home to Aram. So that is the kind of man Naaman is. He actually is a theological pioneer. But these radical ideas are more than just private musings for Naaman. He's not one of these armchair types that just kind of sits back and says, yeah, I think this God might be the only God, and this is kind of a matter of casual thought for him. Naaman shows himself eager to go public with his newfound faith in this one true God. This is going to be something about him that people notice for the rest of his life. Let's read a little further in the passage, verses 16 and 17. But he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, this is Elisha talking, I'll take nothing. And Naaman urged him to take it, but he refused. Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offering, nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Okay, so part of Naaman's statement there is plain enough. Some of it is not too plain, but some of that statement is very offerings and what he has in mind. And that is, he plans to cease all offerings and sacrifices to any other gods. He makes that very plain. He's not going to offer sacrifices to any more of these false gods. Now, that's going to draw some attention when he goes back home. Naaman's absence from those shrines and temples of these other gods is going to draw the attention of everyone who has known him for years. They're going to notice that he no longer goes there. He no longer brings in bulls and goats and sheep and all that kind of stuff to sacrifice to these gods. And they're going to talk about this. They're going to say, hey, where's Naaman? Why does he no longer honor the gods like he used to and like all the rest of his people? And other people will reply to that, and they'll say, well, that fool thinks that all of our gods are false. He doesn't think these gods are real anymore, and that's why he's not here anymore. And they're going to talk about that. People are going to notice Naaman's absence from these shrines and temples of these other gods. In this refusal to worship the false gods, Naaman shows himself eager to go public with his newfound faith. I mean, he is very much going to draw this line, and he's never going to cross it. He's not going to go worship those gods anymore. That much is plain. The other part of Naaman's plan probably needs a bit more explanation. But in short, he will also go public with his worship of the true God. So it's not just he's going to publicly refrain from worshiping these false gods. He's going to go public with actually worshiping the true God. Now you'll notice here that Naaman asks permission. I don't know why he felt the need to ask permission to do this. But he asks permission to take dirt from Israel back to his homeland. He wants 2 mule loads of earth to take back to Aram, back from Israel. Of course, you don't have to ask permission to take the dirt. You just go out there and get it. But for some reason, he felt it necessary to ask permission first before he did this. And apparently, he views this dirt as important for the plans he has to worship the one true God. I mean, this is all bound together. I want to take this dirt because I no longer plan to worship these other gods. I plan to worship the one true God alone. Therefore, I need this dirt. Okay? This dirt is somehow part of this plan. Now, the only explanation I've ever heard for this is still a good explanation to me. It's the best one I can think of. So I'm just going to give it to you. Naaman probably intends to build his own kind of private shrine and altar to God, and he wants to build it on holy ground, which for him is the ground of Israel. Because again, there are no gods in all the earth, but only in Israel, only in this nation. So if I want to worship the God of this nation, I got to take part of this nation with me when I go back to my homeland. Otherwise, it's not going to work. That's probably the idea in his mind. Now, yes, that is very superstitious. Okay? It's not the way we do things. We know that the Lord that was in Israel really is the Lord of all the earth. I mean, he made all the dirt that's there. I mean, we get that. But it's not easy being a theological pioneer. You can't break all new ground at once. You got to kind of take what you can get as you can get it. So we might quarrel with Naaman over his superstition here. We might also quarrel with him because we know that the whole plan in the law of Moses is you're only supposed to have this one temple, this one altar there in Jerusalem we're supposed to sacrifice. You might say, hey, Naaman, we're not really supposed to do that. But again, this guy's a theological pioneer. He's kind of taking things as he understands them. And that's the way he's proceeding with this. He's going to take this dirt back to his homeland. He's going to use that to build his own kind of shrine to the Lord so he can make sacrifices and offerings there. So the important thing to see about this, though, that means very soon the other Arameans are going to be walking past Naaman's house and Naaman's land, and they're going to see this little shrine built there to Israel's God. They're going to see Naaman going out there with his animals, to make his sacrifices, burning incense out there, or whatever kind of rites he has in mind. They're going to see him building this shrine and performing acts of worship on this shrine. They're going to ask, well, what God is he worshiping? He's worshiping the God of Israel because he thinks that's the only God that's real anymore. That's what they're going to see. So both in his refusal to worship the false gods and also in building this shrine to the true God, Naaman is showing himself eager to go public with his newfound faith in this one God. So he's very open about this. This isn't just a private conviction that he has about this one God, the only God to exist in all the earth. He's going to go public with this. However, Naaman anticipates a problem. He's my kind of guy. He's looking ahead to the problems he's going to face as he does this. Let's read verses 18 through 19. He continues speaking to Elisha. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master," that's the king of Aram, "when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this manner." And Elisha said to him, "Go in peace." So he departed from him some distance. So I can see why Naaman was made a general. I can see why he has risen to the highest rank there in the army of his country. This is the kind of man who is always thinking several steps ahead. Right? You got to do that in warfare and in a lot of other things, but especially in warfare, you got to think about, well, if I do this, the enemy does this, then I'm going to do this, he's going to do this. You got to think several steps ahead, like a game of chess. And that kind of thinking helps in war, and it also helps in theological pioneering, apparently, because he foresees this problem for his newfound lifestyle in commitment to the one true God. He foresees these incidents in which he feels it necessary to actually go into this pagan temple and even bow himself as part of the worship of that pagan temple when his master, the king, goes in there to do his duty to the god Rimmon. Now, truth be told, this is the part of the story that we understand the least. Even compared to that thing about the dirt, it's kind of strange. This is maybe even a little stranger, just because we don't know a whole lot of details here about what Naaman is picturing. The real question here is, what is the significance of the king leaning on Naaman's hand? All right, that's the way he describes it here. Whenever my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. What is all that talking about? Well, again, we have to engage in some speculation here. There's a couple different ways we can take it. If we understand that literally, we might think that the Aramean king is maybe an old man or an unwell man, maybe not very physically fit. Maybe he actually needs physical help when he bows and rises. There has to be someone there to help him get down on his knees and then lift him up from his knees as he goes through this bowing as part of the worship there in the temple of Rimmon. That is possible. It's possible that that's all it means. It's very literal. However, it may not be that literal. There might be another way to understand it. Later on in 2 Kings, you don't have to go there if you don't want to, but it's in chapter 7. We actually meet something very similar here. We see that the king of Israel actually has an officer of his own who is described in the same exact way. Now, this is someone on whose hand the king leans. And just very briefly here, 2 Kings 7, verses 1 through 2. This is another story with Elisha. There's been a famine and a siege and all this stuff happening. Then Elisha said, "Listen to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria." The royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered the man of God and said, "Behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" And then he said, "Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it." Another story for another time for sure, but you notice there that the king of Israel also has this officer, and the description there is the king leans on his hand, right? So the same kind of thing that you see with Naaman with his master. Now it's possible, of course, that both kings are old men or maybe unwell and that they need some physical help. Maybe both kings are very old or not very healthy and they need some officer there to help them bow and get up and do the stuff they're going to do. But my question is, why have a general do that? I mean, here's this guy, Naaman. He's the highest ranking guy in the army. Why have a general do that? Okay, why not some servant? Why not some other guy? There might be a little more to it than just the literal meaning. To me, if you ask me, it sounds kind of like one of these titles or honors that kings usually give out. I'm going to lean on your hand. You're the one that's going to fetch my scepter for me. You're the one that's going to get my robe. You're the one that's going to put the crown on my head. All these kinds of things that kings do just to create all of this ceremony around them. Well, this is the way you honor people in a kingdom, right? You allow these other higher-ranking people to take part in the daily life and the things that the king is doing. So you're going to be the guy on which I lean when I go into the house of Rimmon. That might be it. It just might be some kind of title or honor. Truthfully, we don't know for sure. We have no idea for certain what this means by Naaman being the man upon whose hand the king leans when he goes into the temple of Rimmon. What we do know is that Naaman sees a recurring problem for his commitment to the one true God. And this is a big one. I mean, his vow here is he's never again going to serve these false gods. He's only going to serve the true God. But oh, by the way, I regularly have to go into this temple. Naaman knows that his duties require him to be in Rimmon's temple, and not only to be there, but to bow there when his master the king goes in. For a man to commit himself to the worship of Israel's God alone, as the one true God, such bowing in a pagan temple is incredibly problematic. This is obviously the first problem he sees as he embarks upon this new way of life, and it is a big one. For Naaman, the good news is that Elisha does not see this as a problem. And so the man of God, the current prophet in Israel at that time, does not see this as a problem. Let's have a look again at the way he answers Naaman as he talks about this. Back to verse 18 and 19. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, go in peace. That's it. Go in peace. Now nobody in all Israel at that time spoke for God as authoritatively as Elisha. To the point where when Naaman shows up and the king of Israel is freaking out because he expects, the other king expects this king to heal Naaman. He's like, I can't do this. And Elisha just said, don't worry. Send it to me. I'll show him there's a prophet in Israel. I mean, Elisha is God's man in this country at this time. And this man of God simply says, go in peace. That's it. That's all there is. Go in peace. Done deal. You might expect, it's very strange, you might expect Elisha to take more of a stance against bowing in the temple of Rimmon. Who was Elisha's master, right? Elijah, the prior prophet before him. And what happened there? The whole thing with the prophets of Baal, Israel's worshiping this false god, and Elijah put an end to that as well as he could. And it's a very hard line stance. I mean, Elijah, with a J, is very much the stereotypical hardline prophet. Well, here comes Elisha. He's just like, go in peace. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about your time in that pagan temple. Just like, are you serious? Really? I mean, just go in peace? That's it? That's all you're going to say? You might go to another story. This happens later in history for sure, but certainly relevant. How about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Right? Remember those guys? When a king told those three men to bow to a false god, they refused. They just adamantly refused because why? They serve the one true God. They're not going to serve these other gods. When they were threatened with death, they still refused. Even though they were going to be punished by being thrown in that furnace, they still refused that. We hold them up as great men of faith. You might expect Elisha to command Naaman accordingly, to tell him, no, don't do that. Don't go into that temple. Don't bow to Rimmon in any capacity whatsoever. Don't do that. But Elisha just says, go in peace. Don't worry about it. Shalom, just literally, shalom. Just says that there. Furthermore, it's not even abundantly clear whether Elisha views Naaman's bowing as wickedness at all, whether it's actually even a sin. Did you notice that Naaman asks for pardon? That's his word. The Lord pardon your servant in this word. That's what he asked for. He wants forgiveness ahead of time for what he thinks is a sin. He's asking for pardon. When Elisha replies, he doesn't say you're pardoned. He doesn't say you're forgiven. He just says go in peace. Shalom. That's it. He doesn't even bother to extend pardon at this point to this man Naaman. We might have said our way of saying that go in peace might just be don't worry about it. And that's all he says to him. There's not even really any confirmation. Yes, this is a sin, but God's going to pardon it. God's going to forgive it. There's not even any language like that, really. He just says, go in peace. Elisha, God's prophet, tells him that it's no problem to bow in the temple of Rimmon. Therefore, and this is what I meant when I said this, the details of this passage show us that the true servant of God here can participate in some of this paganism without any guilt. At least in this man's case, Naaman's case, that's what's happening here. And this is in the Bible for us, serving some purpose. We're supposed to learn something from this, about this true man of God participating in this paganism without any guilt. Which brings me now to the purpose of this sermon, the last heading of this sermon. And my attempt to answer this question: what could such a curious passage have to do with our lives? What can we learn from this? Why is it in our Bible? Why are we studying this? Well, in my opinion, the application to you is that you can find some consolation in this passage when you sacrifice your own holy desires on account of your love for other people. Say that again just to make sure my application is plain. You can find some consolation in this passage when you sacrifice your own holy desires on account of your love for other people. So that's what I think that you can get from all of this, and how I would like you to think about it when you read this passage from now on. We Christians live in a world, in whatever country of the world, we face surroundings much like Naaman faced in Aram. I know it all seems very foreign to you, but really it's not all that different. The people all around us live in some kind of darkness of mind. We talked about the view of the world at that time, with gods everywhere basically, and yeah, that's pretty dark, but really the darkness is everywhere, and in every time. It changes with each generation, but the darkness is always there. The darkness of mind is always a true fact about life in this world. It may be pre-Christian darkness, where they're still serving all these gods. It may be post-Christian darkness, very much like we see now, where people used to have these strong Christian ideas at work in their culture, but they have moved on from all of that. Might be like that. The darkness might even be Christian darkness, if you want to speak of it in that way, with the professing Christians of the time just having a lot of superstitions and false doctrines and things that are just not helpful at all for conveying the true doctrine of God. Darkness of some kind everywhere is the status quo in this world. And not only do the people around us show an ignorance to truth or a reluctance to embrace it, they have also created whole cultures around that darkness, whole practices, customs, ways of living that are governed by these wrong ideas they have. These cultures are the very image of the people who made them. Distortions of truth, permissions to sin, and preoccupation with trivial joys, all the way down the line. And so it's just, wherever you go, that's what you're going to find. So as Naaman readied himself to return to Aram, he probably had a feeling, much like you have whenever you leave your front door in the morning, depending on what kind of day you expect to have, who you expect to see in the day you face ahead of you, or anytime you go anywhere really in this world, maybe other than a church meeting. Anytime you're not going to be around the people of God, you get this kind of feeling of stepping out into a world that is very foreign to who you are. So really, Naaman's world, your world, it's all the same thing. The only thing that really changes are the nouns you use to fill in the blanks for the gods people serve, or the ideas they have, the practices they do. Whether it's bowing in worship to Rimmon in the country of Aram, or the pop culture of this country here in America, fundamentally, it's not any different. It's all the same thing. It's all the same darkness and its results. And since our surroundings are so similar to Naaman's, we actually face similar situations as we think several steps ahead in our lives. Don't tell me you've never thought like Naaman did, as he's thinking ahead to his life. It's like, okay, this is going to happen. How do I deal with this? You do that all the time, all right? You do that. I'm pretty sure you do that as Christians very often. And it's always the same thing. It's always these situations, whenever you get there, you find yourself in frustration asking the question, why am I here? Why am I doing this right now? How did I find myself in this kind of situation? These things abound. I hope they certainly abound for you as much as they abound for me, so I'm not alone in thinking about these things as often as I do. Let's just throw out some examples, okay? Let's say, just to throw one out there, your extended family's Christmas gathering, okay? All the family getting together, some Christian, some not Christian. What happens then, okay? Just think about the times you've been in those situations. what happens there? It's like, okay, sure, at your house, whenever you were just kind of celebrating Christmas with your family, you know, your wife, your husband, or whatever, your kids, you made Christ the center, right? You did it, right? You made Christ the central aspect of Christmas. Then you go to this other house, and these other people, they got Santa Claus, I mean, they got this, they got that. Their Christmas tree is like, what is all of this? You've got like rampant materialism with all the presents and everything. You've got flying reindeer. You've got all this stuff coming in. And your cousin, he's hitting the liquor a little hard. He slides into his car at the end of it. He's like, oh. And you're thinking to yourself, what am I doing here? Like, how does a Christian find himself in this kind of situation again and again and again, and just going along with it, not making a ruckus over anything, just kind of going along with these things? Perhaps you face a situation on a more regular basis, right? Maybe at your work, at your job. Maybe your job constantly puts you in these situations where you find yourself maybe not directly responsible for wickedness, and you're certainly not responsible for the actions of other people, but you're just kind of tied to what this other guy's doing. What he's doing is not right. You see it happening, like, should I really be here? Should I be a party to this? Sometimes my job involves me in that. I manage the office of an appraisal firm, and people get appraisals for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are frankly not good reasons. And if I knew those people as their pastor, I'd have a very strong talking to with them about the things they're doing and what they're planning to do. But I mean, there I am, part of that whole process. I mean, my job takes me into those kind of situations often. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe you're very often taking your children into situations where it's just like, I don't know if I want my kids really to hear what this person says, see what this person does, and yet I kind of have to be here for some reason or another. So maybe you're just facing that kind of situation. But in every case, it's the same thing. Why am I here? Here I'm a Christian, I live for God, I serve God, I stand for righteousness, but here I am, in some sense, a party to this person's wickedness, going along with this sin over here, just not really doing anything about it. I'm just kind of here. I'm just kind of going along with it. I remember something Paul Washer used to say about some of his preaching engagements. You've probably heard him say it many times if you listen to his preaching much at all. He always talks about finding himself at Six Flags over Jesus. You remember that expression? Can you remember that? It's like, and here I am at Six Flags over Jesus. You're really kind of cranky about it. Typical Paul Washer. I mean, he just finds himself at these preaching engagements, like all this kind of silly stuff going on in God's name. I mean, you've got people like doing all this silly business, and they think they're worshiping God, but they're not. He has to stand up and preach in the middle of all this. It's like being at Six Flags over Jesus. Sometimes it probably was literally Six Flags over Jesus. He was probably speaking at Six Flags at some point. I don't know. But each time you can tell, he sees himself. Like here is just like, why am I here? Like, I'm a preacher of the gospel, the real gospel. Not this shallow stuff that everyone's peddling these days. But why am I here with all these youth groups and everything? It's like, that's seriously it, isn't it? We as Christians find ourselves in those situations a lot. For Naaman, is bowing in a pagan temple alongside his master, just kind of going along with everything there. For you, it's this, or this. Fill in the blank. Whatever situation makes you say, why am I here? That's your temple of Rimmon, and you do it all the time. So in our own lives, as we experience these situations, we often feel these great conflicts within ourselves, right? These situations, they create conflict within us between what we desire and what we're actually doing. On the one hand, we probably imagine ourselves taking a bolder stand for God in the middle of those situations, just really letting people have it, telling them exactly what's wrong with them and how you're not going to be a party to this, you don't stand for this. Really give them a piece of your mind, which of course is a piece of God's mind, right? Because you stand for God. You're a Christian. We might refuse to participate. We might eloquently protest the foolishness around us, maybe even endure some scorn for the cause of righteousness and truth. We might have those kinds of daydreams about meeting the situations in that way. Yeah, that doesn't happen, does it? Right? At least not always. Your imagination gives way to reality. You just kind of find yourself repeatedly reliving these situations. Maybe you groan as you do. Maybe you do as much as you can in those situations to distance yourself as much as you can, but you're still there. You're still participating in these things. You're still part of all this darkness that's around you. and you're not really taking the kind of bold stand that you imagine yourself taking. This conflict we feel and how we handle it is the modern day Christian equivalent to bowing in the temple of Rimmon and then getting out the door as soon as you possibly can and get back to doing what you know you ought to be doing. But you know, Naaman did that for the rest of his life. He would go in this temple, fulfill his duties, and then get out of there and probably go, make an offering to God, to get himself back in the right frame of mind. Well, you do that too. It's just not bowing in a pagan temple. It's just something else. Believe it or not, that actually leads me to the good news of this sermon, the actual point of all of this, my whole purpose in preaching it, coming back to this idea of some consolation for us as we face these situations. As it happens, the consolation extended to Naaman also extends to us. If the situations are similar, then the consolation is similar. Naaman expected that his culture's surroundings would require him to act regularly in ways opposed to now what his holy desires are. These are right desires. These are good desires to put away these false gods. Serve the true God. Dedicate yourself to that the rest of your life. That's a holy thing. But he sees problems with that. And to Naaman, the word spoken in response to this conflict was not even a word of pardon, but a word of peace. Just go in peace. Shalom. Consolation. Now here you are, running circles in your mind around these terrible dilemmas that you face as a Christian, wondering if you're doing right, wondering if it's possible to do right and know that it's right. You're going into these situations, you're thinking, should I be handling this differently? Should I really should I even be here? Should I be here doing something else? You're thinking all these things. You're wondering if what you're doing is actually right. Well, guess what? Go in peace, right? Elisha said that to Naaman, and it's in the word for us as we think about these kinds of situations that are similar to his situation. The word for us is go in peace. If the prophet of God will extend, think about this, all right? As you think about all these situations that make you wonder, why am I here? This prophet of God extends consolation to a man bowing in a pagan temple. Just rehearse off the top of your head the number of Bible passages that come to your mind that would make you think, don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. But Elisha extends to him this word of peace, this consolation. If the prophet of God could say that to Naaman, how much more does God want you to have some consolation as you navigate all of these impossible situations? I know you view them as impossible. I view them as impossible. There's quite a few in my own life. Just when I think I get out, people keep dragging me back in, and I can't get away from it. Well, the word to me in those situations is go in peace. Go there, bow in the temple of Rimmon, get out, and then do what you know God actually wants you to do. Just go in peace. And it's as simple as that. I mean, Elisha's answer to Naaman was simple. The answer to us is even simpler. I mean, what you're doing isn't as bad as going into a house of the worship of a false god. How many mosques have you been to? You been to any mosques lately? Any places like that? Hindu shrines? Anything? Done any of that recently? That'd be really bad. You think, oh, that'd be really bad. But apparently there's even a way to go into those in some capacity and be guiltless. So if that stuff is true, surely this other stuff is like, okay, God wants you to have peace as you go about these other things in your life. There is consolation here for us. Now, the problem is our conscience usually doesn't accept consolation that easily. Even right now, you're saying to yourself, really? Really? Is it that easy? Is it just as easy as Elisha saying, go in peace? This? So let's try again. Let's approach this from a different angle somewhat. Maybe give it some more thought as to why Naaman was and why you are considered worthy of God's peace in this situation. Why you can embrace this consolation as you go through this terrible stuff that you have to face. So let's think about this a little further. Let's go back to the story I mentioned earlier, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Again, this classic example of just die hard, literally die hard, rock hard faith in God and trusting in Him and refusing to serve other gods. Let's go back to them. These men are the classic example of resisting sin, even idolatry, to the very death. Those three men are held forth as examples of righteousness for their willingness to die rather than battle. To die rather than battle. Okay? So in contrast to them, we have Naaman, who spent the rest of his life bowing in the temple of Rimmon righteously, right, with the consolation of God upon him, with the peace of God upon him. Okay, so let's contrast those events a little further and just see if we can get more insight to ease our consciences. And the question is very simple. How can both events be righteous? How can both sets of men, the three guys over here and Naaman over here, how can they both be righteous? Well, the difference is, of course, in details. It always is. Let's talk about these details. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in a situation that was composed entirely about this false god made by King Nebuchadnezzar. That was the whole idea. He's like, I'm going to make this god, and everyone in the whole kingdom is going to bow down to it. There's going to be music. There's going to be all this worship. It's going to be great. What? They're not doing it? Get them in here. We'll burn them up if they don't. The whole thing was very contrived. I mean, even pagan worship doesn't usually happen that way. The whole situation is very much put together by King Nebuchadnezzar, all about just making people back. Make them back. Make them back. Just very much wanting to do it that way. In that situation, to bow like that, it would have been nothing short of idolatry. I mean, the whole situation was about, you're going to serve this God I made. And if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you. And I'm going to show everyone this God is the God we're going to serve. This very pompous, arrogant idolatry on the part of Nebuchadnezzar, for which God eventually humbled him many, many times. But that was the situation. For those three men to do anything different than what they did would have shown just an extreme fear of man and a complete lack of devotion to God. Just the whole circumstances surrounding that made their response absolutely right and necessary to refuse to bow to that idol. Now, let's switch over to Naaman and his situation. As we consider Naaman's request to Elisha, we don't really see any of those details. The circumstances are a little bit different. There's no contrived fanfare around this idol Rimmon. You get the idea, it's just business as usual. Well, time to go to the temple. Time to take the king into the temple to perform the ordinary rites of his religion. Just business as usual as they go about their paganism. Neither does Naaman seem fearful of his life. At no point do you get the idea that this is really kind of the do-or-die situation that we often think of in context of persecution. Certainly not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. And as far as Naaman's devotion to God, he's made that plain. I mean, he's going to, in every other circumstance, he's going to refuse worship of these false gods. He's going to dedicate himself to the worship of the true God. The details here are a little bit different than what you see. Now, one thing in particular, and this is the point I'm really getting at here, when we think of just what makes this all worthy of this peace that he's supposed to have. As Naaman speaks about bowing to this idol, I don't even get the impression that his thoughts are about the idol. I don't get the impression that his thoughts are about Rimmon at all. He could care less about Rimmon. He's just a false god. I get the idea that Naaman is a little more concerned about his master, the king. Let's just read this. The guy that's leaning on his hand, that guy. Let's read this again. Just look at how he words this. Back in verse 18. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship it, and he leans himself on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He's thinking about this entirely in the context of his master, the king, and this bowing that he's going to do. Now, the challenging part of teaching these things from Scripture is that you can't reach back thousands of years and get inside the hearts and minds of the people involved. All we have is what is written, and we have to work with that. But if I had to make a guess based on the words of Naaman, I would guess that Naaman is thinking something like this. My master will bow in that temple. He's going to do it, right? My new religious convictions aren't going to affect him at all. He is going to go into that temple and bow. Who should go with him as he does that? Who better to go with him as he does that? Well, I guess some other pagan could go there. I could resign my responsibilities. I could refuse that. And some other pagan is going to go in there and just say, good job, king. You're right. Rimmon is God. We should serve him. Or we could have this situation to where the man going in there with him is a reminder of how all of this is empty and how none of this is real. And perhaps Naaman is thinking to himself, my very presence there could be a reminder to my master of the better things I have found, and the true God that I met when I went to Israel, the one that healed me of my leprosy. Again, it's hard to get back thousands of years in time and know what somebody's thinking, but just the way he words this, it seems to me that his mind is on his master, the man, the king, and what he should be doing there. In his mind, he should keep going into that temple with his master. Keep allowing the king to lean on his hand as he goes in there to serve these false gods. Naaman thinks, I should keep doing this. And to him, Elisha said, go in peace. And I think that makes all the difference there. We're not talking about this situation where the whole thing is a test of whether you're going to serve the Lord or whether you're going to serve this other false god here. The whole thing in his mind is very much more about this person involved in it, the king. So after all of that, I think I'm ready for my final exhortation, the final application of these things to you, why your conscience should accept this consolation here. I think you should feel free to bow in the temple of Rimmon, so to speak, not for your own sake, but for the sake of the others, right? The sake of other people there. Yes, in certain situations, you've got to have this hardline approach, like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. You cannot meet those kinds of situations with a kind of cowardly compromise that just kind of goes along to get along. I mean, the whole point of conversion, choose this day whom you will serve. This is the whole idea here of all eternity. And you got to make that stand evident. There are plenty of times where you got to play the part of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those times are real. However, other situations, it's more about the people there. You know, I was kind of talking about your family's Christmas gathering and the kind of stuff maybe you encounter there, the stuff that I know I encounter when I go to my family Christmases. You know, it's not about just, I'm going to be holy. You know, it's not about that. Those other people there, they need Christ, all right? And there's only going to be one person showing up there that in any way has the name of Christ on him. So you know what? I'm going, and I'll deal with whatever's there when I get there, and I'll do the best I can. But the people involved, I mean, they need to see Christians. And your situations are like that too. You're dealing with these other people. You got to be salt and light somehow. You're going to have to be around them. You're going to have to be taking part in their lives somehow. And sometimes that means doing stuff that your sense of holiness rails against it, but your sense of love compels you forward. And that's sometimes just how it is. And if that is what is in your heart, if that is your motivation, I think your motivations are much more like Naaman's. In which case, you're worthy of that word that Elisha spoke to Naaman. Go in peace. Go there. Be at peace with this situation. You know, be the person that you are. And just go in peace with it. So that, of course, is my application to you. And of course, I'm not dealing with any real details this morning. Like, well, what about this situation? What about this situation? How do I handle this? That's why, as a church, we try to be involved in each other's lives so we can counsel one another in these things, so we can talk things out, so we can think about things together, share wisdom with one another. All of that has a place. I'm just trying to give you a context in which to have that conversation. And the context is this guy, Naaman, spent the rest of his life serving the Lord, but also bowing in this false god's temple. He did it for a reason. Elisha approved of that. There was very much peace for him in that situation. We can have that too. And I want us to remember that as we go into these situations in our lives. I want us to have that kind of peace like Naaman. Okay, well, as I normally do, I'll summarize these things for you. We can have a time of questions or comments or whatever happens then, and then we'll get ready for our meal. So first of all I did, the passage here that I read is 2 Kings 5, verses 1 through 19. And my main passage is there at the end of that. I just read the passage so we can get the context. And then we jumped into heading number 2, which was in this ending to this story. We're amazed to see a true servant of God participating in paganism without guilt. Bowing in the temple of Rimmon, go in peace. It's all fine, apparently. And then finally, I just applied this to you all, that you can find consolation in this passage in your own circumstances, when you have to sacrifice your own holy desires on account of the love you have for other people. It's a legitimate thing. Naaman, I think, was doing that. You have all the reason to do that as well. So that is what I think we can learn from bowing in the temple of Rimmon. That is all I really had to share with you today. If there are questions, I'll try to answer them. I've already told you all I think about the dirt that Naaman took, so I don't have much more to say about that. Any other questions, though, I'll try to answer, or comments from the crowd, we can hear those too. Whatever. Anyone? I don't know what to talk about this past. I didn't really want to talk about it either, I just thought we should, right? Anyone? No hands. Okay. Okay, one hand. Great, thank you.
I felt like